Let's go to Davos, where this year's World Economic Forum is taking place. And joining me is Rachel Kyte, who's the Dean of Tufts University's Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. And she's also the former CEO and Special Representative of the UN Secretary General for Sustainable Energy for All. Also joining us is Rupert Read, the spokesman for Extinction Rebellion and the author of This Civilization is Finished. Thank you both for joining us on The Newsmakers. Now, you're both climate experts and you are both there at Davos. Rachel, can Davos actually move the needle with regards to inequality and the climate crisis?
Well, I'm always sceptical when I arrive in Davos, but I have to say this year's different. It's more sober. It's more disciplined. The meetings that I'm in, which are meetings on energy and heavy industry, the difficult things to decarbonise, people are serious, people are a little bit humble. Humility is not a concept that you often used to find here. And so I do think that the message is beginning to get in, to sink in. And the message is coming from investors, and the message is coming from Greta and from other kids all over the world, asking their fathers and mothers when they come home from work, what are you doing now that you know how bad the crisis is?
Rupert, would you agree this year is different?
So this is the first time I've come to Davos. I travelled by train, unlike some of the participants here. I'm struck by the fact that, yes, there's a lot of talk about the right issues, but look, there's a lot of problems with the setup here at Davos. Can it really make any sense to have all these people flying in by private jet to supposedly tell the world how to become more sustainable? I think the organisers of Davos, if this is going to continue, this organisation in future years, should ask themselves questions like, well, what about if we had a virtual event instead? Or what about if we had an event where it was required that people didn't take flights to get here? However challenging that should be, perhaps there should be more different World Economic Forums in different parts of the world to minimize the amount of air travel. Because at the end of the day, one of the main things that I see here, as long as hearing a lot of warm words, is an enormous amount of pollution. And let's be very clear, there is no future if we have the amount of private jets that we have at the moment in this world. That is just not possible to square with having a future for our climate and for our children.
Rachel, would you agree with Rupert's analysis of Davos?
Yeah, I don't disagree with the fact that there has to be systemic behaviour change, and I don't disagree that it's a rarefied atmosphere here of elitism, which is, you know, very awkward and uncomfortable. I think it's also a forum where only just over 20% are women, and that's the highest number they've ever had. So there's something that needs to change in the setup. But I do think what I've seen is a value in having CEOs of different industries sitting together, and for the first time that I've witnessed, having them discuss what are we doing to get to net zero. Net zero or climate was always sort of the last thing that they would talk about, if they talked about it at all. But I was in meetings on the shipping industry, on cement and steel and oil and gas, and we've got a long way to go, but the conversation is different. And it's the starting point is we've got to do this. Now, let's see whether the words turn into action quickly enough.
Indeed. And Rachel, just on inequality, Oxfam, their report shows that the world's 2,153 billionaires have more wealth between them than a combined 4.6 billion people. And many billionaires are there at Davos. You say you see a value of having those CEOs in a room. So are we asking them to change a system that they've created, so to speak?
Yeah, so the capitalism that we have today doesn't serve the planet, and it's not serving people. So we have to solve for inclusion, and we have to solve for the climate emergency. So, you know, some people believe, therefore, we have to overthrow capitalism. A lot of people believe we have to change the way that we operate capitalism today. I'm in that second camp. I think lots of other people are. And the question, therefore, is, will the financial sector, which drives performance, start to factor these issues in? Will it measure companies differently? Will it put pressure on? So you've got shareholder and people pressure, and then you've got investor pressure. And that's the conversation that's going on here. Now, will it work or won't it? You know, we can debate that here and elsewhere, but that's the conversation here, that what we've got at the moment is broken. And frankly, I've never had that conversation and never heard that conversation in the way that I'm hearing it today.
Rupert, you have very strong messages, Extinction Rebellion. I've seen the video of your march on Davos. What would you tell those CEOs?
Well, I was in a room last night with a bunch of CEOs and policymakers, and what I said to them very starkly was, this is an emergency. We've seen all over the world now what happened in Australia in recent weeks. This is something which can affect the most developed countries, the most rich countries, now just as much as it can affect the poor countries. We are all vulnerable, and we are all becoming more vulnerable every year that this goes on.
Okay.
Here at Davos, most people are talking about achieving carbon zero by 2050,
but, Rupert,
but that is
just to
way too late.
You're telling them, but are they actually getting it? Because there's a huge difference. And there was this report by PwC that says it's not even, climate change is not even on their top 10 list of concerns for CEOs. So, okay, you're telling them, but do they get it? Do they feel that sense of urgency? Are they seeing those pictures of Australia burning, Jakarta flooding that we're talking about every day here as newsreaders?
Yeah. So look, I agree with Rachel that something seems to have shifted and the conversation seems more serious than it has been. But are they getting it enough? No, nowhere near. Because for them to get it enough, they would ramp up their ambitions so much more, and they would be pressurizing political leaders so much more than they are doing. If we aim for achieving carbon zero by 2050, that means that this emergency that we are in, and it is an emergency, and we've seen that emergency, as you say, in Indonesia and Australia in recent weeks, that means that this emergency will get worse for the next 30 years at least. Now, when I last looked up the definition of emergency, it didn't say if you're in an emergency, then take action such that in 30 years you'll be able to get out of it. We ought to be operating on a far, far higher level of ambition, the kind of level of ambition that we are talking about in Extinction Rebellion and that our great colleague and supporter Greta Thunberg is talking about. And I would urge people all over the world, I would urge viewers, if you care about your children, if you care about your own life and your own future, if you're not afraid of what's going to happen, if you're not sometimes terrified, then you're not paying attention. Mr. Trump is so wrong about this. If you care about the future, please join us, because it is civil society movements, it is radical movements like Extinction Rebellion, it is people taking action, ecological action to defend parks, wild spaces all over the world. It is those people, it is us who are changing the story. It is us who are moving the dial so that these CEOs and politicians are at last starting to listen.
Rachel, would you say that in your meetings, and your career has been, you know, at very high levels with the World Bank, with the UN, you say there's a shift now, they're discussing it, but are they getting it? Is that emergency there? The world is on fire. Is Davos on fire?
No, it's smouldering a little bit, I think. So there are CEOs, I think, who do get it in the finance sector, in insurance, even in the fossil fuel industries, obviously in renewable energy and electricity and food. In every sector of the economy, there are some who get it. And some are going to manage their way through this transition, some are not. And the ones who don't, I don't think their companies are going to make it. And so what you're seeing here is CEOs saying, you know, I used to be a hero until last year, and now I'm a zero. You know, I can't go home. My nieces and nephews criticize me at the dinner table. I've heard people say that. I've heard people say, you know, the investors are really putting pressure on, and this is confusing, and we've got to do something different. I've heard CEOs say the opposite. I've said CEOs say, you know, this is just the thing. It's not really serious. So we're spread all around, but there are definitely the beginnings of the kinds of shift that we need to see. So I agree with Rupert. The pressure has to come from consumers, has to come from individuals. The pressure has to come from investors and those people who help these companies grow and stay in business. And I mean, I'm a dean of a university, a graduate school. My students don't want to go and work for companies that are going to be part of extinction. They want to work for the companies that have got the solutions. And so access to talent absolutely is concentrating CEOs' minds at the moment.
I want to ask you, what happens in life after Davos when everybody leaves that ski resort? How do those commitments, those pledges actually transform into something that they can be held accountable for? So they're not just empty words. To you, Rupert.
Yes, so I would say action and responsibility always begin at home. It's about what we do as individuals, but the most important thing we can do as individuals is join together. The most important thing we can do is take collective action, like the school climate strikers have done, like we have done in Extinction Rebellion, and then we can start to change things. You kindly mentioned in your intro, Maria, my book, This Civilization is Finished. What do I mean by that dramatic title? What I mean is that everything is bound to change. It's either going to change because our society is going to collapse, or it's going to change because we make changes happen intelligently together far faster than the current political orthodoxy would have it. And the only way that is going to happen is if there is huge, growing, ongoing pressure from the citizens of the world. It's starting to happen. Let 2020 be the year in which it really, really takes off, and every single viewer can help to make that happen.
Rachel, how do we help that happen, and how do we keep that measure and enforce accountability when those CEOs leave Davos and go back to their offices?
Well, the most important individual action, together with everything else, is to vote. We have to have the political leaders that have the courage to sort of say, OK, we're going to become net zero, hopefully before 2050. We might not know every step of the way, but we are convinced that our private sector, our civil society, and our parliamentary or other system is good enough to get us there. So we need more Mette Fredrikssons, we need more Jacinda Ardern's, we need more like the new Prime Minister of Finland coming and saying we're going to do this. And then I think there are specific partnerships coming out of Davos. Every year they come out of here. I was in a shipping meeting yesterday, and we were talking about, people working together, so fuel companies, shipping companies, civil society, those who put their products on ships. Can we get to the point where within 3 to 4 years we've started to introduce hydrogen or ammonia onto certain ships, and we start to stop talking about what we need to do and actually start doing it. So these kinds of partnerships they move from Davos, and of course we have climate negotiations in November in Glasgow in Scotland. So there's a lot of people going from here and saying, OK, by the time we get to November, we have to have concrete commitments, and we have to see action, and we have to measure ourselves against that.
Indeed, they should be measured. Very quickly to you, Rupert. Greta Thunberg says that she will keep repeating numbers until the media and politicians listen. Got 30 seconds. What are you going to keep repeating?
I'm going to keep repeating that we are vulnerable. This is not about 2050. This is not about polar bears. This is about you and your family and whether you have a secure future. Let's make it happen.
All right, we'll leave it there. Both of you, thank you very much indeed. This is a fascinating debate, and we hope next year in Davos we'll have a different message on the climate crisis. My guests, Rachel Kyte and Rupert Read. Do stay warm, and thank you so much for joining us on The Newsmakers. Bye-bye.